Welcome to the last Juxtaposition lecture in 2022. It's been a great pleasure so far, the first half of the semester, with our incredible lineup of speakers, but also with you, such an engaged audience here at the UDK. And tonight, Defne Ayas is with us. Defne and I met, I think, in Amsterdam/Rotterdam already many years ago when you were still working at the Witte de Wit, or at the time called Witte de Wit. So Defne is born in Istanbul, lives here in Berlin. You're a curator, you're an educator, you are a publisher. Most recently, you're particularly a board member and an advisor to many renowned cultural institutions around the world on contemporary art. You've been working in the Netherlands, in South Korea, in China, in the US, in Russia, all over the place. So with great expertise and professionality. I'm very thrilled to have you here. And as I told you earlier, like each semester, I'll try to create a mix of different disciplines within the cultural realm to speak about the work and what the work's about. And tonight is about curation. So we had now a musician, we had fashion designers, we had a theater maker, but now we're actually talking about the mediation, the translation of the arts. And well, that said, I'll open up your presentation, and I'd like to a warm applause for Defne.
And am I
You're very
audible? Very good. Thank you, Lukas, for inviting me.
You're very welcome.
Thanks, UDK, for having a curator after Florentina. Imagine the stakes being high. Lukas asked me to tell you a little bit.
Wait 1 second, because you can. Let me fix the technical part.
Here. What do you need? Just put your...
I use Keynote, I apologize.
Here. Oh
yeah?
no, does it work?
Yeah, that works.
Okay.
Thank you for your help. And off we go again.
All
3,
right.
2, 1, it's
well,
Defne.
same. I had my notes somewhere, but it's okay.
I know,
if
I think I
don't
stole
have
them actually here.
Very
so.
good. In case I... All right. It's me again. Here's our lecture. I start, what makes a curator, right? Or what's the formation of a curator? I think that's the question Lukas asked me to bring about, and I find it incredibly exciting to be following the footsteps of Florentina. I mean, after this amazing visionary artist, the stakes are high. I'm not sure if I will perform, but let's just do it, because as Lukas shared, I've been so much all around the world. I've been in the field for 20 years now in the art world, in so many continental contexts, and finally in Berlin. I'm not bombarding you with everything I've done. This is only like 10-15% of what I've sampled out tonight for you, but I want to start with the latest project I've co-curated, which is the 13th Gwangju Biennale in Korea, because in the art world, you're as good as your last project. So I'm gonna start with that. And if you hear me, I don't know. If you don't hear me, let's try it. Uh-oh. We have a hearing problem. I have sound. Do you hear me? Anyway, this is my last 3 years, basically, during the pandemic, organizing a massive biennial in Asia, which is the biggest in the continent, in south of Korea, in a city that is completely known for its traumatic past, with its democratization movement that came as a result of the country's decision to actually bomb down on its own dissidents who actually revolted to the military regime. So the biennial was actually set up not for necessarily art purposes, but for the purpose of mourning the trauma every 2 years. What took place in South Korea? Are there Koreans, by the way, here? I would like to know in the... Yes, so you may relate what I'm saying when it comes to Gwangju. And I co-curated this with my wonderful colleague, Natasha Ginwala. But if this doesn't have sound, this is a problem for me.
Along the same tracks where you used to walk. Now, many years have passed since that time. On the same ground where you were raised, many traces have left this place behind now. On the same lands where you used to struggle, we are still struggling to make sure that we can live on our lands. Sama palkan mihtai, kus nüüd aegne pruukivaid säed. Talikili abie, lefva sama tate palesta. Sama šaljunalni, kus nüüd aegne piiasid, talikile lood ja lekotame taete siia hästa. Sama etnamisni, kus nüüd aegne pruukiratšed, talli ingeratši pie, vai viesut mien lantana. Lantana.
So what is this? Initially, the biennial, I really wanted to give the idea of a biennial a very gentle funeral, and kind of start with that. And that was not possible because the pandemic hit and the meaning of death took a whole another meaning. And this opening procession that you saw here, which was choreographed by Berlin-based duo 80S, which actually works with also how we are moving in our co-evolution haptically with artificial intelligence. But they also draw with a lot of martial arts and Sistema and Buto and so forth. I asked them to basically score the entire opening for us initially, but now they had to do it in the television studio aspect of the exhibition. So the exhibition all of a sudden turned into a broadcasting studio, and we turned this into a whole ceremonial ground where artworks were invoked, where was a whole score was organized that involved many collaborations. So you see a choreography by Cecilia Bongolea, you see costumes by a fashion designer, you see the smell of Cecile Tolas, you know, the leather is designed by another input. It was this whole collaborative intelligence coming alive at this opening. Guangzhou Biennale was a massive, massive, massive undertaking in the sense of the energy and the collaboration it required from the artists, from all the participants, from all the collaborators, the graphic designers, this amazing spatial collaborator we had also based in Berlin, Diogo Passarinho. The artists who had to really change everything in their lives, like losing their studios, giving birth, losing parents, losing jobs, their collaborations that they set up with various universities being affected because universities were shut down, us getting affected because of all the archival loans we wanted to do from, you know, Wellcome Trust in London, or these shamanic archives we wanted to collaborate with. So it was this like massive holding on together, and let's push through the times, or let's understand the times together effort. Together also with my co-artistic director who was living in Sri Lanka half of the time, so our time zones, you know, 5 continents. Imagine the energy that went to it. I'm still recovering from it, so that's why I'm sort of like relaxed. It's the first lecture I'm doing after that massive endeavor. Like, I haven't spoken in this situation now for 2 years because it was K-drama meets Byzantium meets hyper-capitalism, and Korea is of course a very first world country. Everybody wants to go for, you know, the finest tea, you know, it has the best coffee, you know, like it's, in terms of the pandemic management, it did so much better than anybody else. But of course, artists could not travel when we installed. 4 artists could only join us, and we had to go through 2 weeks of quarantine on site, and everything we do for a biennial to lift off because it has such a political importance to the country. So the president, the mayor, the foreign minister, you know, the K-pop stars, they all show up because it has such a political legacy. So it's not yet another biennial, but it is actually a biennial that was really set up to honor that political uprising that happened 42 years ago, and revive it through the agency of the art. And the challenge of the curator is to capture that bottom-up protest energy that's still there, that spirit, work with that energy all around the world as channeled through the artists, yet at the same time feed the needs of a spectacle that is required by the political machine, and create this consensus machine through the pandemic. I mean, imagine the energy it required. I don't know if you can, but but maybe you can feel it when I talk about it. And it allowed us to do like amazing collaborations, of course, with an artist like Anna Maria Milan, again, based in Berlin, Colombian, who worked with online harassment situations that female gamers were experiencing in Korea. And she basically created a whole live-action role-play scenario through which she engaged with them in various scripted workshops and translated that work into her video. Of course, she could do the first workshop, she couldn't do the next workshop, or working with artists like John Gerard, who engage neural networks to look at the ecological precarity of the world, or an artist like Theo Eshoto, who works with the restitution politics. And this was his way of engaging with two choreographers in the Humboldt Forum here. When objects come alive, like how would they contest the politics that go into the Humboldt Forum. Or Lynn Hirschman-Leysen, who worked with plastic-eating enzymes through a work she's been doing since the 70s, but channeling now the plastic-eating enzymes that she collaborated with Harvard's biologically inspired engineering department of Harvard. She realized this installation with the scientists and so forth through the pandemic. So an amazing opportunity to give artists the agency and the commissions to realize very complex projects, because the budgets are pretty generous, yet at the same time pushing together like through this pandemic situation. And the attention was massive. New York Times gave us 2.5 pages, and I don't mention New York Times in every page, but 2.5 pages for a project that's not even in New York. Like, that is the intensity of the pandemic that was taking off, but also Hong Kong headquarters were gone to Korea, and I think that's why we mobilized most of the efforts online, which was our initial intention anyway, but it even became more urgent. And really trying to create an imaginary that is not about visiting the location, but an imaginary that's a bit a seed planted in people's minds. Like, how can you think of an exhibition that is planted in your mind, not necessarily like physically visitable somewhere far away? So the exhibition was all about the dialectic understanding of the entire intelligence, the spectrum of intelligence as we called it, but basically looking at the patterns that are emergent between our co-evolution with, you know, cybernetic intelligence, yet at the same time looking at spirit beings, matriarchal knowledges, indigenous world makings, and drawing a bit from healing practices from across the world, but also being inspired what Korea has had but has been ignoring. Non-human cognition, you know, we engaged so many spirits, like from the Buddhists to the turtle spirit beings to, like, it was this unbelievable convocations of also like another dimension. So it wasn't only the physical reality that we were really dealing with. But I've come to be called a curator, and I don't know why. There's no other word that can describe my kind of work, and I actually don't know what I can be called. So to me, curating is all about collaboration and conspiring with the artists, and giving agency to the artists, but yet at the same time being able to develop new frameworks. And really asking the right questions, the political questions or culturally relevant questions that need to be asked, and giving it a bit of a bigger casting a bigger spell around them, and really looking at the patterns emerging rather than saying we're really giving the answer. Because, you know, even if we want to look so much into, even if we want to trace the artificial intelligence beginnings, like to Shinto practices or to Korean shamanic practices and so forth, as an alternative to what is done to Silicon Valley. None of us have the answers. The artists are working with all the media. We're all trying to understand the practices out there, engaging the scholarship. And for us, it was really important also to draw from the philosopher Katrin Malabou. I don't know if she's a reference in your school, but I would highly recommend her work on plasticity and labor of the brain. Katrin Malabou is the name. So for me, it's also curating as a kind of an activism in the sense of, like, how do you bend structures, mold institutions, how do you work with the limitations but also push through them. And interested also in how theory is produced on site rather than reading and existing theory, how an artist's work on site, like Florentina's work, what kind of theory can be produced, like while she is rehearsing, while she is presenting her work. Like, to me, that's the most dynamic place to be, and encouraging those scenarios where theory can be produced, where academia can be energized, and where new formats can be invented, more experimental, more prototypes, more game changer. Of course, in the case of Gwangju, what we had to do is engage with the beast of the exhibition, and there was no way to get out of the exhibition because there was a molding building that had to be engaged, and that was a mandate, and the building had to take, so it could not only be living in a television paradigm or in some sort of augmented paradigm. It had to take place. So when it has to take place, then how do you actually go around it and still like make the magic happen that needs to happen? And the process over outcome, I write because I really love going also like with the artist, mindscaping with the artist. What is the thinking that's shaping the work rather than the outer presentation only? Like, what is the politics? What is the woundedness? What is the muscle, intellectual? What are the transactions the artist is looking for? Is it intellectual? Is it psychological? Is it aesthetic? Is it political? Or is it financial? Which I don't really always deal with, but of course you have to deal with, because actually the curator means a fundraising machine. So there are many ways, like when you're invited to a project, you're asked to raise 80% of the funding that is allocated to the artist, that is allocated to the organization, that is allocated to the infrastructure. So you also, as an activist, as you want to call yourself, you really need to engage with the infrastructure of, you know, who's going to do the shipping, who's going to do the insurance, who's going to do the spatial elements, who's going to be the amazing graphic designer that's going to capture everything you want to push through. So it's a massive collaborative juju making, which I think you're also doing in your collaborative like teamwork as well. And it has its realities, it has its dynamics, and it requires a lot of like willingness and intent from all sides. And of course, the value of transdisciplinary, like, you know, what is public making? Because for me, like, curatorial is actually a very political, a public responsibility. It's about really communicating and creating this sort of expansion of knowledge and awareness. And I don't want to like fluff it with words. I really like choose my words very carefully when I say like expansion of awareness. Like, especially with these big platforms, when you get a chance to work with them, the potential is huge. What you can do vis-a-vis engaging media, vis-a-vis, you know, the public imaginary. So it becomes a whole orchestration of efforts. And of course, the key point is also like, how can a curator work with an artist or with artists as the co-creators of future realities, of co-creators of future politics, of our world and its institutions. Like, to me, that's essentially, and that's why I kind of fell in the world of being a curator. But of course, the experimental spirit can be pushed in very small formats as well. So the latest that I showed you was the biggest I work with, but there was also a very small Baltic triennial initiative that I was invited to work on. And I invited to that also two artists, Michael Portnoy and Kira Nova, to collaborate with me as well. In Vilnius, which is an extraordinary place if you want to actually experiment with ideas for shoestring budgets in terms of what you can do with your life, with your art. And that's where we had an extremely small budget, to the point we could not even put together an exhibition on the wall almost. So we pushed the whole triennial through one human body. So this is the extreme version, where you take an actor, an empty vessel, and treat him as the ultimate white cube experience, and push through the whole exhibition and intent of the artist through this empty actor, who would be activated during the day by artists and given instructions. And at night he would be put in an incubator, and then he would be actually having nightmares or dreams that would come alive at a place called Charismateria, and that would be every night channeled by artists, like in the case of Meet Warlop here, or Ragnar here, or Alexandria Bahçeci here. So shoestring budget, 70,000 euro, that's what it means in the art world for an exhibition budget. But to be able to put together a triennial, which sounds good, with a radical edge where you just push through this human vessel. The whole triennial was named after man, which is a white man. I mean, how did I dare to do that with my co-conspirators? 2012 that was, and the whole triennial was called the Mindaugas Triennial. So the triennial was named after the male name. But now I heard in Singapore there's a biennial, they call it Natasha. So the trend picked up and the justice is restored, so forth. And I also engage with Moscow, and that is a place that is very, very dear to my heart in the way the artist community is so engaged and so critically advanced with their discourses. And I had the pleasure to work with that incredibly potent geopolitical hot potato landscape in 2015. Another shoestring budget set up where the building we were given was not even allowed to be, you could not even nail on it. So immediately my co-curators at the time, Nicolas Schaffhausen and Bart de Barre, we decided to again take this radical take, no exhibition, 12 days, let's focus only on artists and their agency and what they want to contribute and how they want to create this inside of a studio experience in the Moscow Biennial site. So basically artists hatching onto each other, doing works on top of each other or doing interventions onto each. So it became a big slumber party with very also critically engaged, keynote lectures by Yanis Varoufakis and Eyal Weizmann and people you are all familiar with in terms of the names, and really talking about dissidents. Like, I don't know how we got away, but we really got away, like doing this Moscow Biennial. And it was again very performative. A Dagestani artist, Taos Macheva, who engaged a circus to display the whole Dagestani history of art with loans from the museum. So on a daily basis we were having performances of this undervalued art history. Chiu Jijie was doing his massive wall paintings. In the meantime, a Lithuanian artist, Augustas, he set up his tea room behind it. So then Robert Longo was crashing the party. He came and there was these tea parties behind this wall. So it was this constant activity. I'm gonna come in with my hammer and build my thing and it was this 10 days of amazingness. Leon Kahane was, constantly rehearsing and learning the art of ballet from a major prima ballerina. And the reason I show you few ideas is it was this spirit of how do you come closer to the inner creation of art, and rather than only focus on its outer consumption, and the aesthetics of gathering and how to gather and what you negotiate in the space and how do you bring the spirit of happenings back to the art history or to the contemporary discourse, which is so ostracized because there's such a big fetishization that also comes with performance, right? Like, it's the spectacle economy that performances feed, whereas the happenings were much more leisurely spirited events in the 60s in New York. Like, if you know a little bit of that art history, I'm sure in Germany there's a counterpart to it. I wouldn't necessarily be able to trace a certain origin for it. And at the same time, I was engaging with the master artists and Armenian artists at the 100th year of the genocide anniversary of Turkey in Venice Biennial to represent the Turkish pavilion together with them, which was a very heavy, intensive project, if you can imagine, to take on that burden of the country and work with an Armenian artist who was willing to do it and put his entire effort into that and capture still the idea of representing the country. So basically, I'm not afraid of these political complexities when it comes to working with artists and art. And that's what I do as a curator, like kind of get in these situations very near and try to work with the context to the best we can. And this was a project that was actually, its publication got censored 2 weeks before we opened it in Venice Biennial. And instead of feeding it to the newspapers, we actually channeled the censored works and immediately involved it also, mobilized it into the space. And whoever came and whoever wanted to know what the works were about could actually hear about what happened. And on the censorship story, we gave it to the press a month later, which is something I share with you because we sometimes have this, like, especially with the cancel culture and everything, like we have this immediate need to feed everything to press and create the big bonanza and the big broadcasting machine. Of course, it has its own positive sides as well, like what can be done, but on the other side, like to be very strategic when you press the button and how do you play with media and how do you work with press. Like those are essential things you need to really know as a curator. How much do you have to know as a curator? There's no limit. And there's, of course, a limit that you always have to acknowledge as well. My growing up and what made me who I am is actually, I grew up in the backstage of a children's theater thanks to my uncle. God bless him, he is not with us. I spent a lot of time in the backstage of a newspaper where I really saw that headlines are crap and I really saw what feeds the headlines. So it was this privilege of having the backstage experience and really seeing the political machine that drives the headlines and seeing that and growing in that and being fascinated by that and never believing in the headlines is really my wiring. And then I had, God bless him, he is also not with us, but I had also a dentist father who spent 6 years of his life in Germany and was so influenced by Joseph Beuys that he wanted to start the Green Party in Turkey. Did you hear about the Green Party? There are people in the Turkish, yeah, I mean, you didn't hear about the Green Party in Turkey, but he started it and we protested and it was all, you know, we were all wearing Greek outfits and on the Bosphorus against the pollution, all that, in the 80s. And it was an amazing initiative, which is now being revived, of course, but like, seeing that an artist inspired my dad to just, you know, the protest. So that's kind of my upbringing. And I share this with you because what shapes the curator like me who doesn't know if it's the right thing to do to call yourself a curator or if you're somebody else. But in New York is where my wiring really happened, and that's where my first job was actually with a talent management agency that was riding on the startup wave of the late 90s, which is, you know, something in Berlin happening only now. You kind of have the same startup lingo finally landing to Berlin. So take it as your incubation lab, take it as your lab for ideas, but don't take it too seriously if you ever get a part-time job or something like that. You know, go for it, but treat it with like some detachment because most of them are fluff, right? So you kind of, but where I engage with this talent management company is I saw the entire New York, I saw, you know, the whole media scene, I saw how there were fundraisers for the Democrats and what it means to do pro bono work for the Clinton Library, Hillary Clinton campaign, and what it means to send a virus to all their clients, which was me. I sent everybody the I love you virus. I was interviewed by Reuters and everything. So Miramax, Harvey Weinstein, he got the I love you virus from me, and I'm not making this up. So if you still Google, you can still find this news. So mistakes, wrong things, learning curves. That company went bust, like many other incubations that happened at the same time. But the blueprints that were developed at the time, the concepts that were developed at the time, vis-a-vis the conversion of broadcast technologies, internet, are still very relevant and are still not mobilized, and the art world is just so behind that game of mobilizing, like what can be actually done with internet. So it was a fascinating, utopian, wonderful pre-meteorite crash, scenario where very smart people came together, tried to create something. It didn't work out, but we all learned a lot from it. From that experience, I ended up as an intern at the new museum in the media lounge, and I sat there 8 hours a day in that darkness and looking at the visitor behavior as they were trying to understand new media art. So it was this exhibition called Open Source Art Hack, and there was amazing artists, Alex Galloway and so forth. Maybe you read him now. At the time, he was a practicing artist. And it was kind of capturing of the hacktivist dynamics in 2001. So that is 20 years ago. I am old. So, and I sat there every single day in the summer in that dark, analyzing people's behavior, how they're afraid to touch this and, engage with the screen and everything. And then they offered me a job, justice, right? So, and the first job was actually developing public programs for this amazing exhibition that was for the legacy of Fela Kuti. And was the whole Nigerian scene from London landed, and it was this beautiful period of, again, a whole learning experience for me. This is a catalog, unfortunately sold out, but try to get it. Try to make it your mission to get it, because it was one of the most amazing exhibitions. And from that experience, I joined a project that was at the beginning with art historian Rosalie Goldberg. All right. Laurie Simmons's work. And this is a massive endeavor. An art historian who wrote all her life, but in the second chapter of her life, she decided to start the organization that produces, commissions, presents live work by artists. And sometimes these artists never dared to create live work, but maybe they did it when they were 8, 9 in front of their parents and failed and never tried again, but there was always something sitting that waited to be realized. And Rosalie was a big inspiration to me, a big mentor as well. And I share this because for a woman, there is never an age. I was sort of rushing in my 20s and 30s to make something with my life as if I have to catch up with the previous generation. But on the other side, I was looking at Rosalie, and she was in her, maybe I shouldn't divulge the age, but she was in her early 60s, really going for late 50s, going for something that has never been done, bringing all her experiences of watching, reading, reviewing into now enabling the making of. So a woman has never an age. You can actually, have your 50s, 60s, maybe you had similar experiences with your mothers or your aunts. So you don't always have to rush to have your breakthrough in your 20s. It comes. And one of the reasons I mention Performa is what I really valued is also how it embraced the 20th century art history. And how it made it as a template to drive and inspire new directions in performance. This is the futurists who, released their manifesto back in the day in 1909 and engaged media early at that time. So there is no culture without media. And it's maybe a big statement, but you have to constantly engage your platforms if you want to have agency and impact. And you might disagree, and I'm sure I'm wrong, but I've always believed myself that media is an essential part of making culture and creating new stories and new frameworks. And the reason why 20th century was also relevant, it's sort of these boys, futurists, right? Everybody knows that history, they were all in Greece at the border of Turkey as war journalists, being so affected by it, inspired by the sounds of the wars, that they decided to implode and explode typography and implode the idea of the museum. So the energy that they brought was really essential to the idea of the avant-garde in 20th century. So the way Performa really traced the idea of performance is early 20th century. Let's look at what happened, but let's also address what has been ignored, because there were also amazing futurist women, of course. Like this one, Valentin Saint-Point, she was actually in Syria at the time and doing her manifestos on lust and eroticism, and restore some of the forgotten histories, but also think together with the artists now to create new directions. And there is, as I showed you here, I mean, to this day, I'm still involved with Performa, and there's about, collaboration with about 700 artists. There has been 600 performances commissioned, presented. And the way Manhattan also works so beautifully is that it is a project that has no walls. It has no site, it has no Bühne, this stage. It works with wherever the artist wants to go. And because in Manhattan you can just walk everywhere, it kind of allows that agility. It's also a wonderful way to engage with the urbanism of the city. But I moved on to learn, because I'm hungry, right? So I went to Amsterdam, and I joined a curatorial training program there. It's the Apple. It's a 6-month crash course where you're forced to collaborate and to create one exhibition. And you don't choose your lovers, you just are put in one grouping as you did. I don't know how you do your grouping, but we basically, luckily we had a group, but there's like a history of groups that fell apart and people punching each other. I mean, it's like a whole history of curatorial training program. But again, I was itching, being for the first time in Europe. I was having all my immigrant moments. I hate this, elbowing, the attitude of the people, and angry. And one day I meet this guy who's on the street, completely neurotic, gave me this like a bit of this Woody Allen film feeling. It's like, oh, I used to own this building. I'm like, oh, that's where we're studying. I used to own it, but it used to be a Nazi looting bank institution. And I'm like, oh, what do you mean? Yeah, it was actually a Jewish bank, but then the Nazis took it over. And I'm like, oh my God, I'm so glad I met you. Like, we have to really now collaborate, because turns out the building was used for €1 a year by the institution in return of not divulging the story, because that was the agreement. So I immediately went after the story, and I found this amazing journalist who actually had the archives to this bank. And the bank unraveled like a massive web of relationships. The looting institution that looted artworks that were channeled by an auction house that became Sotheby's. Or the artworks and the insurance bonds that were looted were now ABN AMRO. The current directors, the previous directors of the Jewish bank were in a clandestine gay marriage, and the director was the Rijksmuseum director. So that, like, any button you push, you get some sort of Dutch history. And if there are Dutch here, you have a very small country, so it's like 16 million people, right? So it's basically everything is just connected. And I invited an amazing artist, Michael Bloom, who was as thrilled by the history, and he is Israeli artist, who came and basically recreated the whole bank to the point that we had people walking in, old people walking in, saying, oh, this bank still exists? And we're like, no, like it doesn't. It became, again, headlines. It's the first time I actually had this taste, okay, like this can shape. Like now art can actually engage with headlines and create discussion. This is also the time when restitution politics were not there yet. Now it's a given, I think, for your time that museums are returning their Kandinskis and everything, but this was really the beginning. And thanks to this story, we were also able, my colleague was into more colonial expeditions and how these expeditions are completely part of the nation myth making and how they're actually failed expeditions, not real expeditions. So he wanted to engage with all these colonial myths, Stefan Russo. And because I was engaging with this bank story and he wanted to loan these failed expeditions tools from the Rijksmuseum, we were able to create this whole exhibition that actually started poking holes into colonial legacies that also influenced nation-state legacies. I'm gonna make it, I have 10 minutes, you said, right? Then I went to China. I'm really like, I'm like, what happened to my life? So I'm now 46. I'm really reviewing what happened. Thanks to you, we're reviewing together. But I watched Wong Kar-wai's film In the Mood for Love, and I was so into going to Hong Kong. I was writing to everything, electric companies, like, I'm coming to Hong Kong. Anyway, I fell in love, I got married. My husband's like, okay, let's go to Asia, fine. He got a job in Singapore. I'm like, no, we have to go to Hong Kong. And then I got the job with NYU in Shanghai. They were starting. I really believed this university, you know, it's going to be this amazing American-Chinese thing experience. Turns out it's going to be a real estate company. Are we on record? We are. Yeah, that's fine. So anyway, I believed in the NYU, and I got involved. I started a very experiential art history course where the students were all placed in artist studios, so they were all doing, you know, translation work or studio work with the artists. They were having their exchange experience, and I was sort of shaping the whole course. Co-learning environment, very effective, very generous from both sides. And now my husband also moved to Shanghai, and we lived there for a while. And in the meantime, of course, engaging with the city politics of Shanghai, bringing, you know, some of the performer productions that took place, traveling them. This is the time when China was hot. Everybody wanted to be in China. Right now, you cannot even go to China. Your Chinese friend doesn't even want to stay in China. Times have changed. And, you know, or if they want to go back, they can't, or if they go back, it's difficult, or they, you know, it's very difficult time now. But, and I loved China. I could speak Turkish. There's 25 million Uyghur. I could, like, understand 65, 70%, all the, you know, I don't want to typecast in any way, but, like, you know, the drug dealers, the pickpockets, like, everybody is speaking, like, Turkish, and my Chinese friends take it that I'm the credible one because I can engage with the streets, like, in a different way. It's a hilarious situation. And this is also a place where I met a wonderful collaborator who's been a sinologist, who's been living there for 25 years, Davide Quadrio, and with him we started an agency there, and we called it a non-profit agency. We registered it in Hong Kong, but there's no such a thing as non-profit in the sense of registering takes such a cumbersome act because it's such a civic initiative. There were like maybe 4 institutions that could be registered, like British Council or something at the time. So anyway, we registered as a non-profit company in Hong Kong, and we teamed up with artists who wanted to produce live work, like Cao Fei. This is the beginning of metaverse. Like, this is second world. Anybody dealt with second world? I don't know. But this is like the dinosaur of the metaverse. So an artist who has a vision for a commission, who wants to travel it. So basically we were part of this interest in China. Museums want to come, you know, Guggenheim wants to come, this wants to come, everybody needs a venue, everybody needs to bring their collection. How do they bring their collection? And there was a lot of luxury room to say also, no, we don't want to engage with you, Guggenheim, because we don't think you're doing it the right way. But there's also a great way to say yes to Van Abbe Museum, and because they say we don't want to just bring our own collection, we want to actually invite Chinese artists to choose what they want to bring. And those are the very different, like little tweaks that make such a difference vis-a-vis what it means to do cultural exchange. So I was more in this like diplomacy meets commissioning agency spectrum, but also very interested in the fact that my language was so viable in Shanghai and being able to trace it across, right? You have the whole Central Asia that speaks Turkish, the whole northern part of China basically, and try to understand this greater China, but also try to understand this greater Turkey that I've been avoiding for all my 20s and so forth. So China actually allowed me to also trace a bit through the partnerships we set up with the Prince Claus Fund, engage scholarship, bring a network, put things together. And that actually comes to my last point of going to Rotterdam to an institution now called Meli, and Meli is a character from an anonymous character in an artwork by Ken Lum. It's a new name for the institution because when I was there, apart from all the institutional changes I brought about to the program there, I also basically left the institution by encouraging my board to make the call that there has to be a change to the name of the institution, because Witte de Wit is this super respected institution in Europe because of its legacy, also with all the directors who were there, Chris Darkon and Katrin David, who did the documenta, like a massive sort of engagement with world contemporary art history trajectory from 90s till now. And with my period, we had to address that the name is a colonial officer's name, and that came about through an artist's work who raised the question, whose constellation of activists we had invited raised the question. And there are many lessons learned. It wasn't that easy to say yes was easy, but for me it was. But to hear yes was not so easy by the activists because the yes was also heard as a way to suppress. So it became really complicated. It's like here's an institutional director who is on the same side with the activists in the pursuit of changing the name, but saying immediately yes is actually seen as a way of suppression. So that's where I really learned a lot from that experience. And this very amazing place in Rotterdam, and if you ever go, it's called Meli, allowed me to really embrace a lot of the values that I put in that process over outcome about my approaches and really test what really works. And I invited, let's say, an artist instead of and this was an exhibition making institution, only exhibitions, but I came to really stretch. Here's Alexander Singh who wants to create a play, a 3-hour theater play that he's never written and produced before. So he came on board, started living in Rotterdam. We set up a studio instead of an exhibition. So all of a sudden the artist studio was in display and we thought, what a great idea. We loved the idea. But then, after 3-4 months, everybody is trying to speak to you as an artist and it gets a bit like, okay, I don't want to speak to everybody. So we had to put the windows to the artist studio that was on display in the exhibition space. So it's an ongoing involvement because what happens with the exhibitions, they are usually frozen and you cannot touch it. Whereas I'm a big believer, you have to constantly organically grow, adjust, learn, add, if you can. If your team is willing, if budgets allow, not always it's possible, of course. But I don't believe in this refrigerator aesthetics of an exhibition fixed sprayed 5 minutes. And thanks to Alex, we could engage very broad teams. What does archaeology and Bible and Hindu studies have in common? We could do lectures 5 hours on the importance of shit in British humor, but also in Freud, but it's also what an underpinning it is for a human civilization. We could do talks on, it was these 12 hours summits that he and his guests organized monthly that informed the script and the object making, and it ended up being this amazing play that we also took back then to New York. But this place was also a place where I could mobilize to also deal with some forgotten China histories, because there was this amazing Dutch art historian who was best friends with Ai Weiwei, actually, and Ai Weiwei designed even his cemetery. They were very close. And Hans van Dyck, and the Communist Party in China is also co-founded by a Dutch guy. So for me, it was very interesting, like to have this Dutch guy in the 1920s, but here's this Dutch amazing guy who was so incremental to the Chinese art history and bring a lot of the archival material around him, bring his legacy together. Again, a white man. I don't think I could have done it now. But the kind of practices he looked at in terms of the hybridity he created between what can be sold, what is non-profit, you know, we're all trying to figure it out in China. In the meantime, he indexed 5,000 artists. Half of them didn't think they can be contemporary artists because they were in union photographers and so forth. So his agency was actually very, very important. And we did this beautiful, and everybody wanted to do a project around them. It was very, very like, you know, Ai Weiwei wants to protect them, and we want to, like, and then I was kind of this outlier, you know, I'm not so in it, so I can actually bring all these people together and ask an institution, and anyway, you get the idea. So, testing a lot of things. Paolo Pivi wanted to lift off this amazing Tulku archive from 19th century onwards, a photographic archive of reincarnated masters of Tibetan Buddhism. For you, it's a history of photography and some sort of Google engine, you know, like a Google image engine looking exhibition, but to the believers, it's a praying site because it's a replacement, the photography is a replacement of Tanka paintment. Or we work with A.A. Bronson to look at spirituality, and at the cross-section of queerness, what does radical queerness means vis-a-vis art, religion. So he was able to bring in his own ancestors, look at, you know, another exhibition where we look at artists as criminals, criminals as artists, the same obsession. You know, creating a whole new platform, like working with this amazing Pan-African collective. Quarter of them are homeless poets, but also amazing queer scholars, 25 of them, moving to Rotterdam. This is 8 years ago, having the opening with Kelsey Lu, unbelievable. And a whole 8 year of programming that concluded with the invitation to the Dutch artist Wendel van Oldenburg, who brought her constellation of activists who raised the issue with the name of the institution, which was not only what they raised, of course, and Witte de Wit has actually taken the bullet for all the whiteness of institutions. It's not Witte de Wit that had really issues, it was the bullet that all the institutions really deserved. And really, for months, engaging with the topics around race and racial equity. In the meantime, Black Lives Matter was really picking up in a massive way. And really expediting this decision also with the board, you know, facing your team who says we're not racist, but everybody after 3 months realizes how racist we are in our everyday choices. Opening it up to discussions, not making overnight choices in the sense of like, you know, I could have easily said we're going to call it Rotterdam Art Center overnight and nobody would have been angry and nobody would have netted. But because we left it open for 8 weeks, at least saying we're going to make a change to the name and announce it, but didn't change it, that created a lot of headlines. And right wing got mobilized. In a small country like Netherlands, this matters, became a national election item. Should names change, not change? So Witte de Wit became really part of this giant worldwide movement that questions actually what the names should be. Should there be renaming? Should they be forgotten? In my mind, I was thinking maybe I should leave calling it with or without. So it still sounds like it, but the imaginary or the sound is still there. But then I was told Witte de Wit in Dutch means whiter than white, and I'm thinking, how can it have lasted so long? But then coming from Turkey and coming from the experience of military coups, like it always bothered me that we have this military guy's name. But I never really questioned it myself because that colonial awareness was just, you know, seeping through my body as well. So many learning curves I can share nonstop. But I ended, and this was the time of Wendelin's project. I had also mobilized Zeitgeist with Ahmet Öğüt and Goshka Masuga, a collaboration between two artists in two parts. They were just sharing what they have in common, basically. Very blunt, like flat way of calling it, but yes, but you know, fallen monuments or monuments to whistleblowers, and they were really working with the themes of destruction as well. So when the institution was at its most fragile, going through the storm of name change discussions and more, this exhibition that was actually also working around the notions of destruction and history of destruction in art history, starting with Duchamp, and how it can actually be also generative and productive. I ended my program there with a project called Kunsthalle for Music. We changed the name of the institution for that project only, and it was a scoring of music pieces by many, many artists, as scored by a composer, Ari Benjamin Franklin, who actually lives here. Imagine a 2-hour musical exhibition, no artworks, but you just go from one room to the other, follow the ensemble he created, follow the scoring of the repertoire as it's being performed. Beautiful ensemble created. So it was basically my way of disappearing from the institution with this music project. And now I'm in Berlin. And what's next, God knows, but I'm done.
Thank you so much, Defne. Yeah. For this very insightful and open and honest introduction to your entire life. We are having a red thread here. Actually, this word doesn't exist in English. I realized it's called the common denominator. Oh. We have a common denominator in our lectures, and that's biographies. Have you noticed? Like, everyone is very personal. You really get to know where they're coming from, how they got there. That's why I also asked you in the group to ask, why do you study what you study and where do you want to go? It's like that's your source code, no? And don't underestimate it. There's a lot of potential in that. So I obviously could immediately start with a few questions. I would like to get your brains already started. This is the moment. Oh, you already have, Sophia already has a question. Perfect. So then I don't even have to break the ice, but you can do that.
First of all, thank you for your presentation. I got a question regarding your interesting choice for me regarding the curation of Moscow Biennale after 2014. When Russia actually already invaded Ukraine, and highlighting Russian culture while it is committing genocide of Ukrainian nation. And my question is, the main point may be, how do you feel about it? And another one, what do you think about it, having a power of choosing what to present to the audience and choosing Russian culture? That's it. Yeah, thank you.
So at the time, actually, when we engaged with the Moscow Biennial, it was a lot of critical dissection of the notion of Eurasia, which was also a political agenda that was compartmentalizing my country's politics as instigated by Dugin. Maybe you know some of the elements, very right-wing philosophical forces. So Moscow Biennial 2015 was really a way to engage and not leave alone the Russians at that time, but also bringing in Ukrainian artists and working with them also at site, like somebody like Alevtina Kakzadeh, who was actually constantly every day broadcasting what was going on in Ukraine in the heart of the exhibition. Or working with another Ukrainian artist who was creating a whole installation, even though she doesn't live in Ukraine. So we were actually very aware what was going on in Crimea and how it was affecting people's lives. And we wanted to bring that conversation and not be afraid to bring that conversation while we were doing this installation. So by no means my sympathy with the Russian art workers and does deny what's happening in Ukraine. I condone what's happening in Ukraine massively. I mean, who am I? We all are. Like, it's ridiculous that in 21st century we have to deal with this. But I am a big believer that we could, to the point we can engage, we should engage and not leave the people alone. Not the country, but the people alone. So I felt the same way vis-a-vis my engagement in China. I feel the same way vis-a-vis my engagement with Turkey, with Iran. I mean, you know, no country is clean. Everything is built on spoils and blood and swamp. Even my Mitte apartment, you know, like, what is it built upon? So we are all living in a compromised world. We're all trying to navigate the complexities of that world. And working in Russia was a very, very difficult choice. But seeing how they were engaging with their own politics and how critical they were and how they were trying to create that agency for them, and to see my possibility of expanding that or broadcasting that a bit more with the criticality that I'm bringing, with the constellation of artists and thinkers that I'm bringing over there, was essential to me. And then in terms of the power question you asked, right? That was your second question. That is a lot of questioning of, like, you have to also constantly question what you're doing. And of course, like, after 20 years, there is a group of artists that you're constantly in touch with, and you're constantly, like, collaborating, and you can keep growing together, and that collaborative dynamic can enhance each other's lives for the rest of our lives. But then you have to also make room for, like, new knowledges, and you have to also constantly critique your own take of things and be critical even when you talk about it, because, like, nothing is perfect. But even my experience running an institution like Meli, to be at the power position was a learning curve for somebody in my activist spirit, because you are actually at the intersection of power and politics and public funding, and you have that. But then, you know, you're completely an activist inside and completely sympathize with what's being written in the open call letter, which is so beautifully written and so well written, and still no institution has addressed actually what they've written. You know, it's not about the name change. That's the symbolic part. Like, the essence is something else. And that paragraph they still have in that letter. To this day, I'm thinking about it, like, and that's why I'm not maybe running back to an institution now. So you have to constantly, like, ask those questions yourself, but make room for the new, of course, like, to the point you can. But I mean, how much can you do also? Is that the other question?
May I maybe specify my question?
No, I think we should give space to more questions as well. It's a big group here, yeah? And then if we can, for you too.
I can go on with this, because we can't leave the people, as I heard, right?
What is it?
We can't leave the people. I'm talking about Russian artists.
Right.
You said we can't leave the people, but
no, I'm not talking about now. At that time of my engagement, at that political moment, that was my intent. Right now,
what's right now?
Right now, there is no engagement. That engagement is finished. Right now, there is no engagement. I mean, of course, you know, friendships continue, and you want to make sure they leave. But in terms of giving, like, the engagement is right now, there is no engagement with Russia. It's a very clear line. But at the time of 2015, there was this effort of engagement, and I want to clarify, and we worked also with amazing artists from both sides who were addressing Crimea, which the world wasn't addressing at the time. So, yeah.
The question more is not about you personally and your engagement right
Yeah.
now, more like somebody with such a broad experience of different countries, different cultures.
Yeah.
What are the options? How do you see this situation? What we should do with Russian artists, because it was their job to prevent this from happening, and they failed. And people who totally support this work, this is a result of artists failing, actually.
Yeah.
So how
It's a big failure, yeah. But it's the same experience in Turkey. It's the same experience. I mean, I don't want to compare pains and suffering, yeah. Like, but there is a failure on the liberal agenda. There is a shrinking of that intellectual space that we thought we can all expand. That was handed over to us from the previous generation. That was, you know, we could work in that space, but that space is completely shrinking everywhere and shut down in many other countries. But in terms of my experience, how it may open channels of, I don't think there's room for dialogue even right now. Like, so it's we just have to understand. There's so much we don't understand what's happening in that. I mean, when you hear NATO generals, they tell you that country will be wiped out and that country will be also wiped out. You're like, what? Like, you know, it's beyond us right now. But we have to constantly co-think and engage. The complexity of the world is beyond, and trying to work with the vectors of volatility is a very daunting task for an artist, for a curator, for a businessman, for a journalist. Like, everyone is feeling like it's beyond volatility, right? But I will think about it. I'm happy to be like, continue the dialogue. Like, if you have this, what can be done, if you are constantly thinking about that, like, or what is not being done or what's not being done correctly, I'm happy to be there to co-think and test out. But I also don't want to feel like we should be afraid of testing when testing is needed. So it's a very, very, it's really strange times.
I mean, not an easy answer, not an easy question, and not a real easy to find an answer to that. But
I didn't want to ask you if you're Russian and Ukrainian, and I don't want to know. Like, you know what I mean? Like, I want to answer how I want to answer your question.
But maybe, thank you also for the vulnerability of the questions, really appreciate it. But just to give, since a big group, also another direction of questions a chance. Maybe I see two questions, one here and one there.
First of all, I want to say thank you for the presentation. It's really inspiring to see people from a similar background succeed and like create such amazing works. My question was, how do you decide on which artists to collaborate with and like which projects to push forward?
How do you decide?
Yeah.
Well, it was really nice to collaborate with Natasha, for instance, on the Guangzhou Biennale, because there was a lot of symmetries that you can bring to each other, like what works, or it's a bit of an orchestration of artists' works in conjunction with each other. Like, you don't want to have 5 artists next to each other who are dealing with a similar topic. Like, it's always a conversation, right? Number one, like in terms of the delegation of power, let's say, it's nice to have a collaborator who actually gives you symmetry and you give symmetry to the other. On the other side, in the teams that we worked with, we looked, let's say, in the case of SAPMI, research, right? Like, we traveled, the music that you heard, the composition in the opening procession is by a SAPMI composer, and she speaks a language that only 200 people speak right now in Sweden. And we did 3 weeks of research pre-pandemic, meeting every artist that Sami artists would say, you need to meet my cousin and you need to meet but the distances are like 5 hours, 8 hours, 12 hours. That's like across, 3 countries, probably 4 countries, Russia, but we didn't actually make it to the SAPMI of Russia. And And at the end, we were at the Indigenous Music Festival, and we just like died for her voice, and for her unabandonment, and for her like sort of inhabited way of approaching all her grandmothers, and we just like, we looked at everybody and we're like, we have to invite her. Like, it didn't end up being an artist we invited. But does it mean we didn't engage? No, like then actually the artists that we had amazing conversations with, we invited them to the podcast, we invited them to the Solidarity Futures panels that we have. So in a way, like, you know, when you survey a region, let's say, you meet amazing thinkers and artists and practitioners, and now you weave in what brings the right energies and ideas to the table, but be as generous as you can be. And some artists have, of course, like more engagement, let's say, in the case of Korea, with the topics we want to deal with, right? Like, not deal with is the wrong word, engage with, like feminism in Korea. Like, it is, if there's, I don't know how many countries, it's like, do we have in the world? I forgot, I'm gonna make up like 160 countries, and and you will fact check and correct me, but basically in the lowest 20 in terms of gender equality. Like, it's a huge issue. So then who are the daring artists? Who are the daring writers? Who are the daring video gamers that have created, you know, who are the new movements? What are the movements? And then having conversations and triangulation. It's a lot of like conversations and triangulations. And then sometimes you have to also go to the more, like, you have to find the combination of the older artists. An older artist who've done this work in the 70s, but invite her to do the new work and show how timeless she is. Like, or you know, we think we're always inventing, but there's so many ancestors like that you can only find out if you engage with your teachers, with your artist friends, with your artist fathers, whatever. Like there's always this conversation is the glue in that sense to the art world. It's very, very archaic world in that sense.
Conversation is the glue is wonderful. Niels, I think you had a question, no?
Thank you very much. First of all, it was a lot of input that I still kind of need to sort in my brain, but that's a good thing for me. And I wanted to ask a bit about your like day-to-day practice, because from all the things you do, it kind of seems that you're in kind of like a social management position in like all of the art spheres that you're in, like kind of connecting the artists and the venues and the people that, I don't know, do the funds, that have the funds or so. So what do you, is there even something like a regular kind of schedule that you have, or is it, how do you communicate, for example, with the people? Is it a lot via like telephone or emails, or what is your day-to-day work?
I'm like post email, I'm about to be post WhatsApp, because now WhatsApp is flooding, right? It was a lot of emails, and one email generates 5 emails. You all know that, but I've just learned it very late. So, and of course, like if you're an improvement freak like me, like constantly inventing, you know, every moment is a moment to invent and change and fix things, and you can of course choose to communicate in haikus and let your team or let the people sort of guess what you mean, which is sometimes a strategy apparently I use, but not consciously, unconsciously. So then the team has to kind of guess what she means, and then we just, okay, let's do it that way. But it's basically, team is everything. The way, but compared to the social aspect, psychology is everything. Like running an art institution is a very psychological, like insight in psychology is essential in terms of limits, needs, articulation of boundaries, you know, expectation management. Because even when a curator visits an artist studio, there's always the immediate expectation we're gonna do something together. So you have to always set like actually this is a conversation I would like to start. There is no project right now, but hopefully we can engender something out of this conversation. So, but it's also a very unsustainable single person enterprise, I realized, because the last 2 years I'm actually don't have the institutional backing or don't have a formal team behind me unless I start my own like, you know, agency or something like in the future. So it's a lot of like connecting the dots. So in that sense, it is some sort of emotional intelligence and feeling of, okay, this foundation would support this artist's work and this artist would actually like this scholar and this scholar might talk about this topic and testing it out. So it's a very hyper situation. Yeah.
In your day-to-day business, I think that's what.
Like you mean you start in the morning and
like
you
what
start
does
your
your
emails?
routine look like? Yeah, working routine.
It's very uninteresting. Yeah. Like.
What you said was a really good input. Thank you.
My favorite part is the pre-installation part. You know, not when it opens, but the pre-opening. Like, you know, also I highly recommend if you want to visit exhibitions, biennials, whatever you want to learn, like go a week before when the artists are there, when they're installing, when you actually want to meet them, when you want to have conversation on site. Like go a few days before the fair when you really want to talk to the galleries, which, you know, like that's the warm part. That's the part I love engaging with. But daily life is a lot of emails, keep them short. I love writing, but I don't write enough. I lost my language in writing. Like that's what happened over 20 years of globalization practices. Now there's like a backlash of hyper-local turn, of course, everywhere. But in that world, I actually was a very good writer in my own language. But now like I have to write in English, then I have to write it. So like I'm more of an action person. I regret a bit of that. And I actually, like I'm also a failed artist, which I didn't mention. That's like, let me drop it to you. But in New York, I had 2 exhibitions. And then I couldn't believe the amount of courage it requires to be an artist. To be yourself, to believe in your work, to go for it, to be relentless about it, to really just constantly energize yourself. And I realize I'm a better co-conspirator by nature. But there are some days where I'm like, oh, I wish I was doing my work. You know, like I wish, or there's so much mediocrity out there. Like, why did I not believe in my practice and push for it? And that's also. So I'll end on that note, or is there another question?
Yeah, exactly. So another question from the back. Then I'll fill a gap because I was curious about it. You said there is space for new knowledges, or you said in the Guangzhou Biennial you were exploring the spectrum of intelligence, you know, with all the rituals and the ceremonies. And I remember now when you were talking about this, when we had we had a couple of flights back from Amsterdam. When I was teaching at the Sandberg and you were still in Rotterdam, somehow I went early red-eye flight, late evening, we happened by coincidence to be in the same flight, and you recommended a book to me, The Secret Language of Birthdays.
Oh yeah.
I bought it, and they're kind of also a different form of knowledge. And now I was curious, and you spoke about the in-app psychology.
Does it work for you?
I'd say some is like a complete failure, and others really worked well. Okay. Yeah, but as with all these things. But what I like about it is an alternative way of knowledge. You don't have to take the full package, but it's just, you know, inspiring the thinking. Yeah. And somehow you see it in your trajectory of exhibitions, more and more going in this direction, and then it kind of comes to this big moment in the Guangzhou Biennial. So
there is always like a bit of spiritual, a bit of political, a bit of performance, and they keep sort of
So can you tell us a little bit more about the alchemy of
But in a way, like I'm glad. I wish I will watch some of the lectures you've had here. But biography is essential. Like your life is essential to your practice, right? Like even running an institution, when I was self-destroying myself, like, you know, over something, like it was actually the institution was hit by this question, or when I was super energized. You know, there's all these life forces that come into play that also work in your practice. And astrology is now like a giant hedge fund billion industry. But at the time when I was really, dating the same persons who were born on the same day, I'm like, what's going on? Like, why am I interested in all this? So the first exhibition in Amsterdam was called Mercury in Retrograde. And since then there has been 3 other exhibitions that have been called Mercury in Retrograde, with no attribution to our Mercury in Retrograde. But what was amazing with the astrology, sorry, I have to mention it, because I work with Willem de Rooij as an amazing artist. If you don't know him, a great instructor as well. And he was also obsessing about the same book. And he ran into Mondrian's archive and Piet Mondrian's horoscope chart. So Piet Mondrian, back in the day, got his Theosophical Society astrologer reading on his birthday. And it's like quite something where he annotated the chart himself and made some of his choices about colors based because of this astrological reading. He made his choice to move to Paris because of this theosophical reading he had. So with Willem de Rooij, we published this book, this chart. It's called Character is Fate, and released it as well to the world, because like Piet Mondrian, the ultimate, you wouldn't expect him to making his choices actually based on his birthday chart reading. Yeah, for me there's, I'm also trying to make sense of the works I enabled and the politics I might have enabled. I mean, back to the question of the contested, in China, like why was I there at that sweet open time, but now it's so shut down. The same thing with Russia, like why was I in Russia at that time? And then of course you are part of the soft power dynamics where culture is also used, where culture is also weaponized, but within that, like how much criticality could I enable, how much diversity, inclusiveness could I enable, but you question like, why? Why am I in Berlin now? Like, why? Like, I mean, what's going to happen here? like
Well, it says ... above you
dot,
here.
dot,
Berlin.
yeah.
Another last question maybe from the audience. Yes, here, first row.
So, after speaking to South and China, what do you think of the art in Eastern Asia, and like comparing to the art in Europe or Western?
What do you mean Eastern Asia?
The art in South Korea and Japan and China.
Did you hear that in the back?
No.
The question was regarding, I guess the question comparing contemporary art in Asia, Japan, South Korea,
I mean, that's
China.
like a giant lecture.
And Western contemporary art.
But very engaged. I find it, I mean, the maybe ecologically it's very different in terms of art. Institutional ecologies are very different what supports artists, and maybe the circuits of transactions in terms of they are very different, but it's really case by case. I don't know what you're expecting me to answer. I like, what do you want to hear? The meticulous nature, or conceptually, like you want me to say they are way too advanced, or something like that.
No, but
but it's really case by case, and it's like every country has its own historiography, has its own issues of testimony, healing needs, democracy struggles, political movements, and there's a lot of tools that can be shared across countries, knowledges that can be exchanged across countries. But Korea has an amazing feminist art history legacy that needs to be known, or Chinese have an amazing conceptual art history that needs to be known. The collectives of the 80s are unbelievable. Like, there's so much to know. Or Japan has unbelievable engagement with the 7th dimension that or 8th dimension that none of us can actually engage from Europe. I mean, every country has its own context and ecology, so it's hard to say.
But maybe as a reference, have you been here in the last semester already? Okay, so if you go back in our timeline, on last semester's lectures, there was another lecture by a curator, Ute Meta-Bauer, and she specifically gave a talk basically about the contemporary art scene, let's say in Southeast Asia. But for many, me included, it was an introduction into an art scene that I was also not that familiar with. So, Ute Meta-Bauer, last semester, check the lecture.
But it's a lot of, like, I mean, the discussions of class, for instance, in Southeast Asia are very alive, that you could have read in the Documenta experience as well, like collectives and class, and very questioning of the hierarchies in the art world. That is Southeast Asia for you. But if you go to Korea, that's more like America indexed in many ways. There are elements of Seoul, but not the city I was engaging with. That has a completely different political wounded legacy. So again, it's case by case. But I'm happy to do a lecture, like, you know, on this whole. And I have to say, like, my relationship to China is not as strong as it used to be, simply because, number one, I mean, of course, the country shut down with the new leadership, but it's also, when I left in 2012, the art market forces took so over that many artists weren't interested in even traveling abroad or learning abroad or exchanging abroad. We're sufficient here, like, we don't need more. Like, why should we go to Europe? Why should we go to...
So, looking at the time, it's almost 8 o'clock, and thank you for all staying along. We have our famous final question, and you know the deal by now. A room full of aspiring designers, artists, dancers, musicians, actors, architects, did I say fashion design already, and so forth. What's your final piece of advice?
Oh la la. I think I gave some feedback, no? Like, for no rush. There's no rush. Make the best out of your 20s and 30s. Throw yourself into commercial situations that have nothing to do with the art world, where you can bring that intelligence and that various approaches into your own work. In that sense, don't be complacent, like really push yourself to jobs and, you know, whether it's money or entertainment or to help your friend, just throw yourselves in other contexts that are completely not familiar to you. I would do that in my 20s. Don't lose your language. Stick to your language. I think in this hyper-local turn, it's really important to master your language. And claim your language. Always push the contours of your practice. Never take it for granted. Just keep pushing it. I will not say fail, like that's what they always preach in like art university. Don't be afraid of failing, but like you will make mistakes, and there are the like really points where you learn, as you know. Okay, that's it.
Thank
if you have
so
questions,
so no
I'm
rush.
Here. No rush.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Thank you so much, Defne. Thank you all for being here again. I wish you a wonderful time in between the years. We see you in the beginning of the year. And a warm applause one last time. Woo!